Okay, to finish up discussion of the contracts clause. So we've talked about the three elements that give rise to, basically you could say, a prima facie violation of the contracts clause would be that there's a state interfering with the material terms of a pre-existing contract. So that's the rule. A state is not allowed, general rule, a state is not allowed to interfere with with material terms of a pre-existing contract. Now, in a case called Blaisdell, and you're reading, Minnesota, Blaisdell, Minnesota during the Great Depression suspended, or I should say lengthened, the redemption period in foreclosure cases, under which somebody who had lost their house, obviously you're all familiar with mortgage contracts, You enter into a mortgage contract with a lender, with a bank, and what? They give you a loan, to purchase your house, You agree to pay them back with interest, obviously, and the remedy, This is a secured transaction, The remedy, if you default on your payments, is foreclosure, and under your contract with your lender, that will specify what the procedures are for foreclosures, how a bank would foreclose, when they would foreclose, how long you would have to redeem your property, and all that is specified in the contract. Well, Minnesota comes along and extends, the redemption period. This is again during the Great Depression, they're trying. Everybody's losing their homes, And Minnesota, among other states, is trying to do something. One of the things they do, let's say, if you default, and there's a foreclosure proceeding, you have more time than you used to have, to essentially come up with the money to get your house back. Now, obviously, lenders, banks are going to object to this, and so let's run through, what the problem is. Is Minnesota a state? Yes, it is. Minnesota is a state. Are these pre-existing contracts? Yes, Minnesota, I should be clear about that, Minnesota extended the redemption period, including for people who were already under contract, Those are the people who needed to be protected, the people who were losing their homes, who already had contracts. So are they pre-existing? Yes. Is the redemption period a material term of a contract? I'd ask you to consider that. If you're a bank, why did banks are not charities, we know that. So banks are not in the business of giving out, loan money without securing, their interest. So a bank would argue, and did argue, banks did argue, that they wouldn't have entered into these contracts at all without the ability, to claim the property, in exchange, or I should say, as security, in any default situation. So the court doesn't take issue with essentially those three elements having been met. It's a state that interfered with pre-existing contracts and material terms of those contracts. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court in the Blaisdell case said it was going to let it go. Okay, and here's why. So these now I would call factors. The court says we're looking at some of the what's going on here. We're looking at some factors. We're going to consider some things that maybe make it okay under these circumstances for a state, in this case Minnesota, to do what it did, interfere with pre-existing material terms of a contract. So number one, there's an emergency, This should ring, well, I don't know, this should sound interesting right now, given what the country is facing right now. I want to, again, be very clear. Congress passes a law and says that we have more time, extending the redemption period, under mortgage contracts. There is no contracts clause violation because that's Congress. You're looking for a state doing it. Do states start to do this, Do people start to fall? People probably will, People will start not being able to pay rent. That's a different issue, but obviously still having to do with housing. There are people who are going to miss mortgage payments. There are going to be defaults, So are you going to start seeing state by state, states responding to this by trying to change these contracts? Well, the first thing the court said in Blaisdell was there's an emergency. Well, look what we got here, A pandemic, that I think by all reasonable accounts now constitutes an international emergency. Second, the court said So we are impressed that Minnesota, right, in its law extending the redemption period, that the law is only in effect for so long, right? It's a very limited duration, right? It's not an open-ended, right, change in these contracts. It is, right, it's very limited in time. So you would look for that too. If a state interferes with material terms of a pre-existing contract, right, first of all, is there an emergency, right? Again, just looking at these are factors. Second of all, when you look at the law, right, whatever law is at issue, right, is it a permanent change to contractual obligations or is it a temporary change? If it's temporary, then it's more likely that the court's going to say that that's okay. And finally, there's the one you knew was coming, right? It's the throwaway factor in just about every legal case, reasonableness, right? The court says the changes, right, that Minnesota made to these pre-existing contracts are reasonable in scope under the circumstances. So, you can run through the entire outline with the Blaisdell case. Minnesota is a state, these are pre-existing contracts, these are material terms of the contract. Therefore, you have what you might call a prima facie case, right, of a contracts clause violation. But the court says, if states do that, we will consider the following, right? Is the state responding to an emergency? Is the change, right, in contract obligations temporary? And are the changes reasonable in scope under the circumstances? So that's it for the contracts clause, and that really concludes our discussion of state power in general. And so in the next video, we will finally move on to procedural due process, and then hit state action. And as I said in the last video, then we'll be ready to do some review for the remainder of the term. Stay well, and we'll be back with another video sometime soon.